Good evening, everyone. Welcome to the Canadian Museum for Human Rights. I'm Rhea Yates, Director of Digital Outreach here at the Museum, and it's my pleasure to welcome you to the fourth installment of the President's Lecture Series. Bienvenue à la quatrième dans notre série de conférences du président. In addition to those of you here tonight, I also want to welcome those watching via live stream on YouTube and Facebook. Je tiens à reconnaître que nous nous trouvons sur des terres ancestrales, sur le territoire visé par le traité numéro 1. Ces terres sont également de grande importance pour le peuple métis. J'aimerais aussi reconnaître que l'eau dans le musée provient de la Première Nation numéro 40 de Shoal Lake. It's our custom to acknowledge that we're gathered on ancestral lands, on Treaty 1 territory. These lands are also the homeland of the Métis people, and it's our custom to acknowledge that the water in the museum is sourced from Shoal Lake 41st Nation. Tonight, we continue our President's Lecture Series, which focuses on contemporary human rights issues impacting people around the world today. The first gathering in the series was held in January of 2018 with writer and journalist Michael Petru, who spoke about ISIS propaganda and its role in the Yazidi genocide. The second welcomed John Burrows, Anishinaabe from the Chippewas of the Nawash First Nation and the Canada Research Chair in Indigenous Law at the University of Victoria. And the third welcomed filmmaker, journalist, and politician Vladimir Kara-Murza, one of Russia's most outspoken advocates for democracy and human rights. Kara-Murza spoke about how the dangers faced by opponents of the Putin regime and how Russians can help bring about democratic change, and how we in the West can help. Today, we'll hear from investigative journalist Megha Rajagopalan, whose work exposing surveillance tactics in China has received international acclaim. Another result of her work is that she's no longer permitted to work as a journalist in China. Later in the evening, members of the audience will have the opportunity to ask questions. For those on the live stream, I invite you to submit your questions anytime during tonight's program through Facebook, Twitter, or YouTube. On Twitter, you can tag us. Our address is at @CMHR_news in English and @MCDP en français. To introduce Megha Rajagopalan, it's my pleasure to introduce Museum President and CEO, Dr. John Young. Dr. Young has served in this role since 2015. His focus on bringing together diverse and sometimes divergent perspectives on human rights is the inspiration for the President's Lecture Series. Under his leadership, the museum is becoming a global leader in human rights education and dialogue, with an emphasis on building and retaining our public memory. Please join me in giving a warm welcome to Dr. John Young.
Thank you, Rhea, and what a great privilege it is to be with you here together this evening. I think many of you know that here at the Canadian Museum for Human Rights, we strive to cultivate dialogue not only on human rights challenges of the past, but also on the challenges of the present and of the future. In so many ways, we have come to rely on technology to help us tackle these challenges we face. Scientific advances have helped us feed a rapidly growing global population. Medical researchers and doctors make it possible to treat disease and prevent chronic illness in some of the least privileged places on the earth. And even though we witness violence and atrocity in places like Syria, Myanmar, social media and digital communication are making it more challenging than ever before to commit human rights abuses and cover up, deny, or minimize the evidence. And yet, some technological advances also create human rights challenges that we are just beginning to understand. I expect that many of us here are carrying smartphones right now in our pockets. I do hope they are turned off. Last week we had the Supreme Court of Canada, and I had the opportunity to speak a little bit, and I forgot to turn my phone off and it started ringing in my back pocket. That was rather embarrassing. These devices that we carry in our pockets are many times more powerful than the computers that landed the first human beings on the moon. And my smartphone affords me some great benefits. I have adult children who don't live here in Winnipeg, and I'm delighted when their faces pop up on my screen in the evening through FaceTime, and I get to ask or answer questions, offer congratulations for something, and express my love from thousands of kilometers away. At the same time, as smartphones and digital communication become ubiquitous, our locations, interests, expressions, and opinions can be captured and analyzed by governments and corporations on an unprecedented scale. And, as we will hear this evening, this seismic shift in our privacy can have dire consequences for human rights. Among those reporting on the implications of this new surveillance technology is our guest tonight, investigative journalist Megha Rajagopalan. She is an international correspondent with BuzzFeed News, currently based in the Middle East. Her work on the emergence of mass surveillance has earned wide recognition and praise. In 2019, she won a Mirror Award for uncovering links between Facebook and religious violence in Sri Lanka. In 2018, she won a Human Rights Press Award for documenting China's use of state surveillance in Xinjiang region to repress the Uyghurs, a Muslim minority group. She was a Fulbright Fellow in Beijing and a Research Fellow at the New America Foundation in Washington, D.C. In addition to her work for BuzzFeed, Megha has published in the New York Times, the Wall Street Journal, Time Magazine, and Wired. She has shared her expertise around the world at many different venues, including Yale University, Georgetown University, the European Council on Foreign Relations, and the Oslo Freedom Forum. And now we are very pleased to have her here at the Canadian Museum for Human Rights. Please join me and give a warm welcome to Megha Rajagopalan. Thank you, Megha.
Thanks so much. Well, thank you all so much for being here. This is such a great honor, and I would like to particularly thank the Canadian Museum for Human Rights for hosting me. I actually had the opportunity to visit the museum yesterday, and I couldn't help but admire the way that the museum has interwoven both the challenges and the accomplishments of Canada's human rights record, both historically and in the present day, with human rights challenges in many other parts of the world. And I think it's a unique museum in that it focuses on sort of the philosophy, of human rights, as opposed to focusing on a particular time and a place in history. And I think it's this focus that, it sort of lays plain that when we talk about human rights, we're talking about about rights and values that are truly universal. Things like freedom of speech, our ability to assemble and to meet each other, our rights to privacy, and our freedom of movement. And what I want to talk about today touches directly on all of those rights, I think, and that subject is mass surveillance. And we often think about mass surveillance as touching primarily on our privacy rights, but I think that it has a deep impact on all of these kind of fundamental rights we hold dear, particularly our freedom to express ourselves and to move in the world without fear that somebody is watching us with ulterior motives. And I'm going to talk about this subject primarily in the context of authoritarian states because that has been largely the focus of my work. But I believe that these lessons are incredibly relevant no matter where you live in the world, whether it's a democracy like Canada or if it's in a country with more of an authoritarian government. And it's my belief that the rise of mass surveillance in today's world and the technological tools that have enabled it to be enacted on a very broad scale are now posing a fundamental threat to these basic human rights and freedom that we would wish for all people around the world to have. And I'd love to start by talking about a place that I spent a lot of time in my career as a journalist, where the kind of rise of mass surveillance is perhaps at its most plain and it's at its most troubling. And that's of course, China. And I want to talk particularly about this region called Xinjiang, which is in the west of China. And I think by now, all of you guys who are, who are newsreaders and who care deeply about human rights issues will already be familiar with what's happening in this part of China, which is the kind of mass repression of Uyghurs and other Muslim ethnic minorities who live there, which is a population of some 11 million people. But in the context of surveillance, I'd love to take you through a kind of thought exercise about what it would be like to live in Xinjiang as a Uyghur or as another Muslim minority. So I want you to imagine sort of waking up on an average day, whether it's in Winnipeg or whatever city you come from, and going about your kind of morning commute. And the first thing you might do is get into your car and try to commute to work. And if you lived in Xinjiang, you might hit a checkpoint. And at this checkpoint, you would get out of your car. And one of the first things that might happen if you're a minority is that somebody, like a security officer, might ask you to take out your phone and plug it into a little machine. Or they would ask you to open it with your own thumbprint or your password. And they would look through your phone for messages to people who lived abroad, messages containing, sort of religious material, photos of things like mosques, Arabic pop songs. Any of these materials could kind of get you into trouble. And perhaps the next thing you would do is stop to fill up your car with petrol. And in the course of doing that, before you entered the gas station with your car, you might have to go through a facial recognition scan, and you would have to give your ID. And this is what petrol stations really look like in Xinjiang. And after that, you might want to drop your son or daughter off at kindergarten. And this is a real image of a real kindergarten in the southern city of Kashgar. I took one of these images, actually. And you can see that there is high fencing and sort of loops of barbed wire all around this school. And to go inside the school, you would need to go through airport-style security. And this sort of has the look of a place that is in a war zone, but in fact, it's not. This is just sort of what the security environment is like there. And after you went about your day, you might come home and start to have a quiet dinner with your family. And if it was a particular if it was a particular day of the week or day of the month, you might get a visit from a local Communist Party official. And they might do something like scan a QR code with their phone that's printed outside your house, and that would tell them how many people are supposed to be living in that house. And when they went inside, they might ask you a series of questions that they would ask every single week. Questions like, did anybody come to visit this week? Is anybody in your household pregnant? Did anyone change jobs? And did you practice your religion this week? So what's the significance of all of this information that's being collected? Well, Human Rights Watch and other researchers have found that all of this information and lots of other little factoids about your personal life, things like your electricity consumption, where you've been traveling, even whether you've turned your phone off, all of that feeds into a kind of centralized information system. And this is called the Integrated Joint Operations Platform. This app that I'm showing here, it's not a real, it's sort of a mock-up of an app of what it looks like. And security personnel sort of use this to manually enter information, and it gets sent to this sort of centralized database. And this is incredibly significant from a human rights perspective, because the cost of violating this sort of network of written and unwritten surveillance rules can be incredibly dire. And it means that you could end up in a place like this. And this is an aerial photo of a mass internment camp of the sort that hundreds of exist in the region of Xinjiang. And people are being sent there for sort of very small offenses. And we know from those who have sort of left this camp system in various capacities, who have escaped or have visited and then left, that the conditions inside are generally pretty dire. They're places where people are subject to things like sleep deprivation, being held in stress positions, serve extremely limited quantities of food, and forced to do things like sort of memorize Communist Party propaganda, sing patriotic songs, and being taught the Chinese language and the kind of Chinese Communist Party's version of history. And in 2017, I actually visited one of these camps. I was the first journalist to actually find one, and the only reason I managed to do it is because I had a set of kind of GPS coordinates that I had gotten from somebody who knew about this camp because it was in his hometown. And I saw this huge compound, and it was sort of clearly marked as what it was, and there was this huge kind of poster outside, and if you read Chinese, you can see that it says, cherish ethnic unity as you cherish your own eyes. So the meaning of these places is really pretty clear. And so for me, my experiences in China, especially those experiences reporting in Xinjiang, it really sparked a kind of intensity in me to try to learn about how mass surveillance works, because I saw how destructive it could be when it was specifically used to target a minority group. And so I started to talk to activists and other people who were contending with mass surveillance in many other parts of the world, including Southeast Asia, the Middle East, and elsewhere. And I started to hear that many of these people around the world were facing kind of the exact same challenges, and many of them were really at a loss for how to handle them, especially as technology continues to evolve and as these very powerful governments continue to become more adept at using it. Now, in most parts of the world, mass surveillance is not going to be as heavy-handed or as visible as what's taking place in Xinjiang. But often that makes it almost, almost as dangerous and even more insidious because we don't necessarily see how it's happening. And as I started to have these conversations, I started to believe that government surveillance, aided by technology that's made by private companies, is a force that is completely reshaping our world. And it's fundamentally altering the balance of power between authoritarian governments and the movements that seek to challenge them. Now, it hasn't always been like this. When I started my career as a journalist, kind of in the 2011-2012 era, the atmosphere was of sort of great optimism, I think, for the use of things like social media and other technologies that would connect us. This was an era of the Arab Spring protests, which we didn't know yet how they would turn out. Even in China, it was a time when people were using Weibo and other Chinese social media to organize and to reach each other, and would even use memes and things like that to make fun of the government. But what we've seen in the years since is that power dynamic has almost been flipped. As authoritarian governments have become more adept at using surveillance technology, there's less and less room for citizens to use these kinds of technology for their own advantages. And in this discussion about surveillance, I'd love to talk about two separate aspects of surveillance that I think are both equally important, but sort of distinct. And the first aspect is surveillance in the digital sphere. How people are being watched and intimidated in the digital realm, and how governments have started to commandeer social networks and other communications tools to push forward their own propaganda. And the second thing I'd like to talk about is surveillance in the physical world. Things like biometric surveillance and how we are being watched by new technologies as we move through public spaces. So when I think about digital surveillance, I often think of this young man whose name is Kung Raya. He's a young man of about 27, 28 who I met in Cambodia last year. Now, Kung Raya got on Facebook in college, like a lot of us, and also like a lot of us, his original purpose for getting on Facebook was to meet girls. But very quickly, he started to realize that if he started putting up Facebooks and little video snippets of the kind of like student protests and demonstrations he liked to attend in his spare time, he could build up a really big audience. And that was a pretty remarkable thing for him, because in Cambodia, the media, the traditional news media, has always been under a lot of pressure from the government to censor and sort of control their coverage in various ways. But Facebook was this sort of new technology that people hadn't really figured out how to control yet. And he started to sort of use it as his own platform, his own kind of news broadcasting service. But then 2013 hit, and all of that started to change. You see, what happened in 2013 is that Cambodia had an election. And here I should mention that the leader of Cambodia is this guy. He's the prime minister of Cambodia. His name is Hun Sen. He's essentially an autocrat, and he's been serving in that role all the way since 1985. And in 2013, he was being challenged by the opposition, and the opposition didn't win, but they did a whole lot better than anyone expected. And one of the reasons that they started to do better was because of their command of Facebook. The opposition in Cambodia sort of realized that young people there were starting to get their news and to organize on Facebook, and that this was something that was really worth using and learning about. So after 2013, Hun Sen essentially decided, I need to learn about this thing. And so he appointed somebody to be essentially his minister of Facebook. Like, this is a real government position that exists in Cambodia, is Hun Sen's Facebook minister. And when I was in Cambodia last year, I actually managed to meet with the Facebook minister. And I talked to him a little bit about how Hun Sen views Facebook. And the first thing he told me is that they worked really, really hard to build a following so that he could spread his message. There's nothing unusual about that, but what is unusual is that Hun Sen is actually the third most followed leader on Facebook, according to a recent analysis. And the first two are Donald Trump and Indian leader Narendra Modi. So if you think about that, it's quite remarkable, because you're thinking about, first of all, Donald Trump, who everybody in the world cares about, and leader of India, which is an extremely populous country, and also he's posting in English a lot of the time. So the opposition in Cambodia would say a lot of this could be chalked up to follower buying. Whatever the case, Hun Sen has been remarkably successful in communicating his message via Facebook, which is a real big change from pre-2013. And the second thing that Hun Sen's Facebook minister told me is that there's a whole team in Cambodia who's basically devoted to essentially trawling Facebook for accounts that are critical of the Cambodian government. And if they found that an account was too critical for their liking, they would send an email to Facebook and ask them to take down the post or take down the account. And if Facebook wasn't willing to do that, they would just arrest the guy. And that is exactly what happened to Kung Raya in 2015. He wrote what he thought was sort of an innocuous post about something about a color revolution, which he didn't really understand what the term meant, he said. And he found himself getting arrested. And he was, in fact, the first person in Cambodia to be arrested based on a Facebook post, which is something that he had never anticipated because it had never happened before. So the kind of censorship of social media and censorship of the internet at large is a really classic tool that authoritarian governments are now using in kind of an ever-increasing way to control the way people communicate and to monopolize communications almost in a way that existed before the internet. And internet shutdowns are a really important part of that. So the organization Access Now, which documents how shutdowns work every year, has found that there were only 75 internet shutdowns in 2016, and last year there were 196. If you're living in a certain part of South Asia, like Bangladesh or India, or certain parts of Africa, including Sudan, these are a pretty common part of life now. And I want to also talk about this man, whose name is Ahmed Mansour. So when we talked about Kung Raya and people like him in Cambodia, we were talking primarily about public posts on Facebook. And Ahmed Mansour, in fact, is also a person who was arrested based on things that he had written on Facebook. He's possibly the most prominent dissident in the UAE. And he's known for his incredible outspokenness on social media and in sort of meetings with people from the international community. But Ahmed Mansour had another concern, which was the surveillance of his cell phone and his sort of private messages. And when I was recently in Dubai writing about surveillance in the UAE, I talked to some people who had met with him, particularly from the international human rights community, and they talked about precautions that he and other human rights activists would take before he would go on these meetings. They would leave their cell phones at home, or they would work through intermediaries to be able to carry out these meetings. Now, Ahmed Mansour, unfortunately, is now serving a jail sentence of 10 years. But when I was learning about the way he had conducted his activism when he was still free, it struck me that he had fundamentally sort of resigned himself to the notion that his digital space, his communications were sort of fundamentally compromised. And by the way, he had reason to believe this. He had had his phone analyzed by sort of independent technologists, and they had found the malware put there by state actors and made by a company called NSO Group. And when I think about Ahmed Mansour and lots of activists like him, I think about the sort of shrinking space for digital privacy. And I think that sort of brings me to the next thing I want to talk about, which is our privacy in public spaces. So I want to first talk about this phrase, biometric surveillance. So biometric surveillance is a term that's coined by privacy activists. And it includes all sorts of things like facial recognition technology, which you've probably heard about, behavioral analysis, gait analysis, basically anything that encompasses our personal traits and our personal features. And the best way to understand this technology is that it's sort of analysis that sits on top of very high quality video feeds. So anytime there's a CCTV camera around you that's producing a sort of high quality video feed, it's possible to use biometric surveillance on that feed. So face recognition, I'll talk about this first because it's a subject that's been in the news quite a lot. It's actually not a new technology. And in fact, the first recorded use of facial recognition technology, to my knowledge, by a law enforcement agency took place all the way back in 2001. And this was in a suburb of Tampa, Florida. And this was sort of in an area which was like a busy kind of pedestrian pathway. There were shopping centers there and lots of restaurants. And police were sort of trying it out to see if they could track criminals that way. And the police there actually abandoned the project 2 years later in 2003, and they made a public statement saying they abandoned it because it had failed to catch even a single criminal. So despite this, the technology sort of continued to evolve. And there are several reasons for the kind of development of facial recognition technology to the point that it's at today, in which it's sort of widely used all across the world. One of those things is that it became a lot cheaper to collect and store video footage, sort of very kind of heavy data. It's a lot more possible to store a lot of it now than it was back in 2001. And the second thing that happened is that video footage became a lot higher in quality. And the third thing is that the algorithms just got a lot better. So when we think about facial recognition technology, I think commonly, we often think about something that happens to us at the airport. So if you show up at a kiosk, for instance, you put your passport in, and there's a machine that takes a photo of your face, and you assume that it's matching you to a static photo of you, perhaps from your passport. And the reality is, it's not really like that anymore. That's sort of not the cutting edge of the technology. So imagine that you're going to a coffee shop every morning for, a few weeks or a month. So one day that you're at the coffee shop, you might be wearing a baseball cap or have a ponytail. One day you might forget to wear makeup. You might have your head down because you're staring at your phone. Your appearance will change day to day. But in the course of all of those trips, there will be sort of CCTV camera footage of you, and it'll be capturing your face from all kinds of different ways and different angles. And it's in this way that really sophisticated facial recognition algorithms are able to build a kind of 3D model of your head and figure out the way you look in lots of different kinds of circumstances. And the companies that are sort of developing this technology include some of the biggest companies in the world. Companies like Amazon and Microsoft from the United States, as well as lots of Chinese tech giants like SenseTime, Hikvision, which is the world's biggest maker of surveillance cameras, and Megha, which is also known as Face++. And I just want to give you a bit of a flavor of what some of the products that they're working on looks like. And these products you'll see go quite a bit beyond facial recognition technology and absorb a few more aspects of your personal traits. And I think the thing that's important to remember is that all of these traits are sort of, the danger lies when all of these traits are sort of brought together to build profiles of individuals. So this is a platform that's made by SenseTime, a Chinese company that specializes in AI and builds a lot of surveillance products. And you can see that this is taking footage of, sort of a public square, and this platform sort of claims to do a bit of behavioral analysis as well as facial recognition and license plate recognition. This is also made by SenseTime, and it's showing sort of a heat map of a group that's gathered in a public space. And this is a really common product that tech companies are sort of advertising. I don't mean to single out SenseTime because other companies are making this type of product too. And you'll notice that this product sort of focuses on the activities of groups. And if you talk to companies, they'll mention that there's a lot of value to something like this. So for instance, if you're looking at a construction site, you can tell in an automated way whether everyone is wearing their hard hat. If you're looking at a place that's sort of getting too crowded to a point where it's not safe, you can also tell that. But you can easily see how this can also be used by law enforcement, in other contexts for things like finding protests and sort of suppressing gatherings of people that they don't want to see. And this is a product that's, this is made by a company called BriefCam, which is an Israeli company. And you can see that this is sort of a pretty simple search bar, and it enables you to search by different characteristics of a person. And what it's doing is it's searching actually thousands of hours of video footage, and it's searching for a woman who's wearing a red dress. And you could even distill this even further. You could look for somebody with red dress and short sleeves. You could look for someone with a particular face or a face that looks like something. There's sort of lots of different traits that you can search by. And this is the last thing. This is a Microsoft product, and it's an emotion detection software. And what Microsoft says is that this is sort of meant for retail contexts. If you are looking at your customers, you want to know if they're happy customers or not. But emotion detection like this, it's also been used in all kinds of other contexts, things like immigration interviews and job interviews. And that can actually be really problematic because, wait a second, sorry. That can be really problematic because of the bias that's often built into these technologies. So the two portraits here are of two basketball players. On the left, you'll see Darren Collison, and on the right is Gordon Hayward. These are their official NBA portraits. And the reason this is significant is that they're two of the portraits that were used by an academic named Lauren Rue, who's a professor at Wake Forest University in the United States. So Dr. Rue took basically a data set of 400 portraits, basically just like this, and she sort of ran an emotion detection algorithm, a few of them from major companies on top of them. And what she found was algorithms were sort of predicting, or were sort of stating that the black players were more angry than the white ones. Which, if you look at their faces and sort of other portraits of this style, is sort of ridiculous, seems ridiculous because everybody's sort of smiling in these portraits. But I think the thing to remember is that in authoritarian contexts, discrimination like this, it can be a feature, not a bug. And particularly in places like Xinjiang, where racial discrimination on a systematic level is something that the government is actually seeking to do rather than to weed out. And I think the thing that I always think about this is that when you have biometric surveillance, when you have the ability to identify people very, very quickly in real time, or using historical footage of them, it fundamentally has the effect of raising the cost for participating in political action and in mass movements. So here there are three images here of different protests. So one is the top one there. It's a protest against President of Nicaragua, Daniel Ortega. The one below is a recent protest in Hong Kong, and the one on the side is in Indonesia. And what you'll notice in all three of these pictures is that people are covering their faces with a kind of medical mask. So if you are in a protest, there's more than one reason to cover your face. I mean, tear gas being one of them. But certainly a really good reason to cover your face is not being recognized. And I was talking about this with a Nicaraguan academic earlier this year, and I asked him, are people concerned about facial recognition technology at these protests in Nicaragua? And he basically told me, go on Google Images, search Nicaragua protests, and see what you find. And of course, it's a whole lot of images like this. And what he said was, we don't know if law enforcement or security authorities in Nicaragua are using facial recognition technology because they would never tell us. But we do know this technology is out there, and it's enough to make people afraid of it. And I think that that's a really remarkable thing. It shows that even the presence of this technology in the world, it's already having a chilling effect. And I think that's really important because for people who participate in mass movements like this, the vast majority of them are not going to be human rights activists. They're not going to be the kind of rare, brave breed of people who have made peace with the notion that they might go to prison or have worse things happen to them because of their activism. By and large, they're sort of ordinary people, just like you and me, who have families, they have jobs, they have responsibilities and commitments. And for them, if the sort of cost of going out to protest in this fashion is that they might be recognized in an automated way and they might immediately be punished for it, it's a really huge disincentive for them to go out and do that. Excuse me. And I think the last thing I want to talk about is the notion that biometric surveillance out in the real world, is sort of reducing our access to private space. So if we've already sacrificed privacy in the digital realm, on our devices, on our phones and laptops, we want the sort of space that we move in to have a semblance of privacy left. So this notion that you can use CCTV cameras and other forms of real-world surveillance to track people is something that we wanted to test out at BuzzFeed. And this is sort of a little bit of an experiment that we did at Times Square in New York. And this image shows my colleague, Hayes Brown. Basically, we wanted to see if we could track his movements through Times Square without using any specific technology. And in fact, it was not only easy, it was horrifyingly easy. What we did was we essentially matched kind of public camera footage that's being streamed for free online, streamed by a tourism company called EarthCam, in fact, with publicly posted Instagram stories. And within an hour, we were able to identify 6 people and chart their movements around Times Square. And then, in order to not violate their privacy, we had Hayes sort of mimic what they were doing so we could do it for a presentation. So a lot of people that I mentioned this to were like, well, that's horrifying, but I don't use Instagram stories anyway. Guess what? It doesn't matter, because even if you don't use it, you could still appear in somebody else's story. And this is sort of something that we kind of take for granted in a way, at least in the United States, is that in public spaces you're entitled to film someone. And that's a really important right, because it's the right that enables me to film a police officer, for instance, when I'm like stopped on the side of the road, or me as a journalist to film something like a political protest. But privacy activists are now arguing that for this reason, we need to sort of rethink the way we think about public spaces. Because me taking a photo of someone is sort of different from a camera that is always filming and that has the ability to run very quick sort of automated analysis on you. And I was talking to a privacy activist in New York about this, and he sort of brought up the Supreme Court case that was decided last year. It's called Carpenter versus the United States. And this case basically found that police in the US cannot use triangulated cell tower data over like a historical period of time to track someone. So basically they can't track you sort of for a period in the past. And he said to me, if it's not legal for somebody to track me based on my cell phone, why is it legal for them to track me based on my face? So I give a lot of talks on issues around surveillance, and a question that I get really often is, is this sort of a foregone conclusion? there's all this technology out there. There's not a very clear way to stop it. And perhaps as individuals, there's not too much we can do. And I actually really disagree with that notion. I mean, I think technology is just technology. It can work for us. It can make us feel more secure. It can help us communicate our ideas better. And it can really be a force for good. But I think that we have to make hard choices about the trade-offs between those other goods like security and the things that we're giving up, like individual privacy. And we have to make those choices in a way that's really clear to companies and to lawmakers. I think that there's already sort of a rising tide that I can see as a journalist of people that are sort of expressing their concern for individual privacy, both in places in the kind of democratic world as well as in more authoritarian systems. Even within China, where there's very little room for kind of self-expression, there are artists and lots of people on social media, academics, journalists that are sort of making their views known on systems that are on companies that are infringing on people's privacy. In the United States, there are already cities that are banning law enforcement from using facial recognition technology. I would say for me personally as a journalist, I'm most heartened by the people that I've been fortunate to meet who are working to change the systems in ways that protect people's privacy. And I'm thinking about people like Megha Rajagopalan, who is an EU legislator who has been working for the better part of a decade to implement export controls on surveillance technology. And technologists here at Citizen Lab, which is a research institution right here in Canada, that help people like Ahmed Mansour determine whether their phones have been compromised and sort of police hackers in the authoritarian world. I think there are a whole range of people that are willing to address these challenges from different standpoints, ranging from artists and technologists to lawyers and policymakers and journalists like myself. And I think the common thread between all of them is a deep-set belief that people everywhere are entitled to a fundamental level of privacy, whether they live in authoritarian states or in democratic contexts. I think it's particularly important, though, for all of us who have a connection to North America to think deeply about these issues, because I think that the norms that are set in this part of the world end up affecting everybody very deeply. And I think for people who advocate for privacy rights, it's their belief and mine that as technology continues to advance, safeguarding these rights is absolutely critical to ensuring that human freedom persists in the decades to come. So thank you so much all for your time, and I'm really looking forward to hearing your questions and thoughts.
Thanks, Megha. I want to thank you for a very informative presentation, and this is a very important topic. I wanted to start and just ask a few more general questions about your own career choice and the role of journalism today, and then we can get into some further questions and comments about the topic of security, privacy, and surveillance. For the first question, perhaps I can start with it as a personal question. What led you to a career in journalism? And was that something you were always destined to do or determined to do?
No, not at all. I think I was interested in writing, and I think I wanted to write novels when I was a kid. And then when I got to college, I thought I would choose something more practical, so I went for journalism, which turned out to be not very practical at all. But I think I got sort of a bug for it when I was working on the school paper in college. I covered crime in this town called College Park, which is where I went to university, and there is quite a crime problem there, so it was an interesting time.
And great support from your family for your career choice?
They were perplexed at first, and I think actually probably remain perplexed. Yeah.
Okay. There are some occupational risks associated with journalism.
Indeed.
Reporters Without Borders has come out with new numbers. So in 2019, around the world, 30 journalists have been killed for their work, and 6 more citizen journalists. 230 journalists are imprisoned, with another 136 citizen journalists in jail. Those are significant occupational risks and very much a consequence of individuals such as yourself who are promoting freedom of information that helps us be aware of what's going on around the world around us. What advice would you give to an earlier, younger you contemplating a career in journalism regarding those occupational risks, or for any aspiring journalists here?
Right. I think when we're talking about risk, I think the first thing that I have to say is that the risk is very, very high for journalists who are from authoritarian countries that are reporting on their own, their kind of own countries or own hometowns. I think the risk is sort of astronomically higher than for international journalists like myself, although we also face some risk, of course. You know, it's now become a norm for hundreds of journalists to be reported jailed every single year, and that is completely terrible. I think it's already caused you know, quite a bit of a chilling effect in many parts of the world, including China, including places like Turkey and Vietnam, including Russia, of course. I think, to your question about advice, I think that young journalists should think really hard about managing risk. I would never tell anyone not to go into the profession because of this element of risk, but I think it's about sort of being really candid with yourself about assessing these choices, and also about thinking really hard about what it means to protect colleagues and protect sources, and putting that, you know, ahead of your work. I think we're all human first and journalists second, and that has to be the kind of ethical baseline.
Thank you. Let's move a little bit more towards the surveillance state. We had a conversation a couple days ago where I shared with you my experience as a student in the Soviet Union, and whether I was being surveilled or not is always a question, but one feels that one is being surveilled, and that leads to a fair amount of self-censorship and altered behavior. Was that something you experienced in China, or how does a surveillance state achieve its purposes without actually having to surveil anyone, just the fear or the risk of surveillance?
Yeah, I think that's absolutely one of the tactics. Yeah, I mean, there's so many examples I could give, but like, you know, we used to have to go in to the police for like year-end interviews, and I think one year the guy who was interviewing me said like, you know, your flat is really a bit of a mess, like you should get a housekeeper or something. So it's like, you know.
Hint, right? Yeah.
So there's sort of like little things. I think that's sort of a funny story, but I think the more sinister version of that is that it prevents you from making contact with sources that you believe are vulnerable because you don't want to bring anybody harm. And in the industry, we sort of call this the problem of first contact. So if there's somebody that you know you want to reach out to, but you've never talked to them before, you have no way of setting up a meeting, and then they don't have any safe way to communicate. You know, they only have, you know, a Chinese messaging app or something like that. They don't have the ability to download an encrypted messenger. So how do you get them to meet? And this is a real problem, I think, and it's not one that really has a good solution. And I think it's had a chilling effect on journalists for sure, because we don't know who is under surveillance, we don't know if we are, and we don't want to sort of take a risk that would have really disastrous consequences.
We have a film club here at the museum. Last year we watched the movie Das Leben der Anderen, or The Lives of Others, a movie about life in East Germany and the role of the surveillance state. And at one point there's a character who kind of uses that ubiquitous justification. If you are behaving properly, then you don't have anything to be worried about.
Right.
How do you respond to that kind of?
I mean, you know, I hear this a lot, like, why do I have to be worried? And I think that people who make this argument, they're not thinking about the other side. Like, they're not thinking about who is actually getting access to this kind of information about them. So maybe you like your government, maybe you trust your government. Well, governments change, and data is forever. So, even if you like your government, you may not like every individual person. You don't know what kind of motives that person has. And, you know, I also think that there's another aspect of this, which is that it's hard to conceptualize the extent to which different streams of data are being put together. So you might think this one thing is like fine for me to share, but what if you contextualize it with something else? And the last thing I would say is that, it would be a stretch to say everybody has secrets, but it's like everybody has things that they would like to keep private. So I mean, your trip to your therapist's house, right, or office, if you're a young woman getting an abortion, or any number of things that people just want to keep to themselves, they're entitled to keep it to themselves, and even if it's not something that's quote unquote doing something wrong.
So we mentioned earlier that here at the museum, we have looked at ways in which social media and technology can be positive tools for change and
Right.
political change and social change. You've referenced some of that in your presentation. What are the things that we can do to ensure that technology is used for positive change? Or alternatively, is it fair to blame technology? And I know you talked about that towards the end of your talk. But
Right.
Are any advice or counsel to the audience here as to what we might do?
I think we're powerful as consumers. I mean, if you look at kind of the last 2 years that Facebook has gone through, it's really remarkable both the level of strife and the extent to which they've been forced to respond. And I think it's fair to hold Facebook to account because it is such a powerful communications medium. It is essentially, in places like Myanmar and Sri Lanka, for instance, where it is just so widely used that it's almost similar to the internet itself. It's essentially functioning as a public utility for communications, but it's being run by a private company. So the way to hold, but they depend on consumers, right? So I think the way to make sure technology works for us is to really hold companies to account for these privacy challenges as consumers and make it known that this is something that we care about and we want companies to behave responsibly towards. And I think companies are really, especially social media companies right now, they're really concerned about the prospect of regulation. And I think that it's my feeling that they would rather sort of change in these directions rather than risk something like that coming forward. So I think we do have power in that way.
And has that already started in some degree, people unplugging and demonstrating their disfavor or their concerns?
Well, I mean, I reported in Sri Lanka last year after the government essentially shut Facebook down during a time of crisis, and that's happened in certainly more than one country. And that's, if I were Facebook, I wouldn't want that.
So is this kind of a natural adaptation? Technology comes in, it's kind of a positive good, and then people find ways to abuse or misuse technology for something that is maybe opposed to the public good, and then there's another adaptation, behavior changes,
Right.
New technology comes in, or people make different choices. In some ways, it's a bit of a moving target, whether technology itself is a good or an evil, because it's always, it's a moving target. There's always that adaptation coming.
Right. I mean, I'm a fan of the view that technology is neutral in and of itself. Like, I think it can be used for good things or bad things. I think you're right to point to this kind of cat and mouse element. When we're talking about what individuals can do to protect their privacy, a big part of that is, tools like Tor browser, VPNs, like all kind of encrypted messengers, like all kinds of things that you can use to sort of be more private in your individual life. And those tools are developed specifically with privacy in mind. But I think even sort of in a broader sense, a lot of this technology, I sort of alluded to this, but it can be used in positive ways. The kind of defense of a lot of surveillance technology is that it makes us more secure. And we all want safety, we want security, but we have to know what we're giving up. There has to be a level of transparency there. And I would just add to that if we accept that technology is neutral, I think the challenges are not dissimilar from any other social issue, which is that we care less about the tools themselves and more about the people who are in control of them and the people who are using them. So to me, it's not about the technology, it's about government and it's about companies.
I'm also wondering about this right of privacy. You talked about it in your presentation. Is it fair to think that we even have a right to privacy anymore? Or is that just something for previous generations?
I think, of course we do. I mean, rights are something that are obviously codified differently state to state. Yeah, I mean, there's a question, of course, about what kind of right to privacy we have in public spaces, and whether we should be sort of reevaluating the way we think about public spaces in this era where biometric surveillance is so present.
So what's next for you? You invested a fair amount of time and education in learning the Chinese language, building a network as a journalist there, spending many years pursuing really phenomenal stories that have helped inform the world. But now you're not in China, you're in the Middle East, and what's next for you?
I'm lucky that I have a bit of a thematic mandate. I'm sort of continuing to focus on a lot of these issues around technology and society, including human rights. I continue to be very interested in the phenomenon of mass surveillance, especially things like facial recognition technology, and I hope to continue looking at those themes both in the Middle East and sort of in other parts of the world, mostly I think probably in the global South.
Do you miss the opportunity to cover China?
Yeah, of course. It's never fun being told that you can't go somewhere. Yeah, and it was such a huge part of my life. I do miss it.
Okay. Last question for you, and then we'll hear questions from the audience. Any questions for us or advice to us at the Canadian Museum for Human Rights?
Oh, advice. It's hard to say, but I really value the contributions that you guys make to our understanding of contemporary events concerning human rights. So I would love to see more of that. Yeah, and I would love to pose a question to you about. We had an interesting discussion before about surveillance in the Soviet Union, and I'm curious how you think that surveillance in that sort of older style stacks up with the high-tech surveillance of today.
Older style
Yes.
surveillance. Let me share one story. When I was a graduate student studying in the Soviet Union, I went to the public library and found a book that I really wanted, a copy of a chapter. And in the library, patrons had no access to photocopiers. So I had to take the book to a special desk and ask them to photocopy the chapter for me. And I expected, it would take a few minutes. I was told to come back next week.
Right.
Because they had to, I think, first figure out whether that chapter could be approved. And so I had to come back the next week to pick up my photocopy. And I thought, okay, that's a rather interesting element of control, but it was there. And then, during my time away, I came back and fax machines were everywhere, or starting to be in numerous places. And of course, fax machines could serve as a photocopier, and so technology, or the way they controlled one element of information, was now vanquished because of the simple development of the fax machine. But for me, in the 80s in the Soviet Union, it was very much that apprehension. And we knew that there were elements of surveillance within the dormitories or out in some areas of the public. Sometimes you would catch somebody following you. I had nothing to hide for the most part, but it was that uneasiness.
Yeah.
And it was the unsettledness of, I don't know whether I'm being surveilled or not. I didn't really have much to hide. But not knowing and yet wondering is on your mind. And so you engage in, maybe it was good for me as a young man to feel that somebody was watching me at times.
Right.
But it is an unsettling experience, and you do engage in that self-censorship, and as you pointed out, you do worry about the people you meet.
Yeah.
And what impact that might have on them.
Yeah, absolutely.
So the technology has changed, but that unsettling aspect is still with us. Yeah.
Thank you very much, John and Megha, for this discussion. It's now the time that you've been waiting for, where we take your questions. Before we begin, I would just like to remind you that we're specifically looking for questions. If you have any preamble, please keep it as brief as possible so everyone has a chance to participate. Thank you in advance for understanding that. Again, to those who are watching via the live stream, you can submit your questions through Twitter, YouTube, or Facebook within the next few minutes so that we can bring your questions to the floor tonight. And with that, if you have a question, could you please raise your hand or otherwise indicate? We have two staff persons. We have Angeliki and David, who are in the audience with microphones, and will come to you.
Hello. When you publish one of your stories that I'm sure you've done a million hours of research on, what is it like? Are you like apprehensive about what the response is going to be? Just how does it feel for you when one of those stories that is about surveillance and can get you banned from a country comes out?
Yeah, I'm always terrified. I mean, is the honest answer before a story comes out. I mean, usually not about the possibility that it'll be thrown out of somewhere, but more about, I'm really fixated on making sure that everything is right and that I want to be fair to everyone. Of course I write things that are sort of critical, but you want to write critically in a way that everyone can accept is truthful and it has all the context that it deserves and stuff like that. So that's sort of the stuff that keeps me awake. I never thought that I would lose my visa to China, so that was just never something that I really worried about.
We have a question from this side of the room, David.
Hi, Megha. I'll be really quick. The social credit score in China, it fascinates me. This idea that you can quantify or take measures of a whole bunch of different facets of your life and put a number on a person, basically on a person's forehead, right? I watched a video where a young man said, my social credit score is 86 and I'm not even going to date anybody under an 80, right? So what do you think of this whole idea of stroking people's vanity? If that's the game that you're playing, right, and you look down on other people, you go, I'm in the 80s and she's sweet and everything, but she's a 72. That idea of stroking vanity, I think that would work here too.
Yeah. I encourage you to check out Gary Steingard's dystopian novel, Super Sad True Love Story, which was published well before the social credit system was rolled out, but includes some of the same themes, I think. The social credit system is a complicated subject. I am not a lawyer, and I have not scrutinized the kind of many policy documents that underpin that system, but to be clear, it's not as sort of a nationwide system where people are sort of given scores wholesale, but kind of a loose network of programs that have been rolled out in various kind of cities and provinces and sort of include lots of different aspects of people's lives, things like performance on loans, for instance, behavior on public transport, their reviews at work, like all sorts of things like that. To your question about vanity, I think it's very interesting because a lot of people who would sort of defend or say the social credit system is maybe not as dystopian or nefarious as it's often made out to be would sort of liken it to rewards programs that we have elsewhere in the world. I know lots of people, maybe even myself, who are obsessed about frequent flyer miles and credit card points. Social credit system is not dissimilar to that in some ways because it came out of this system where there's a real lack of trust in sort of institutions, because of things like scandals around tainted milk and pollution scandals and things like that. People really value the idea of attaching a score to like a business or even a person to add sort of a level of trust. And it's sort of natural that people would want to boost their scores, both in the kind of like romantic context and also just, in any kind of interaction in a professional context. If you're trying to take out a home loan, these things can be, really very useful to you. I think the kind of danger to it, of course, comes from the privacy side, because you don't really know in the future what these scores will be used for, whether they are fairly applied, and whether there will be sort of room for pushback or appeal on an individual level, and those questions are genuinely troubling.
Thank you. Megha, we do have a question from Twitter. It's from @LeeHaber, and the question is, why is it difficult to get our leaders to care about what's happening to the Uyghurs and other people oppressed by the Chinese government? And there's a short follow-up, what can we practically do to help the Uyghurs?
Yeah, both great questions. Talking about just political leaders around the world, there has been a kind of like vocal condemnation of China's treatment of the Uyghurs, that has sort of picked up speed over probably the past 6 to 8 months. But what there hasn't been has been sort of any kind of, strong kind of economic action, something like sanctions, or, a kind of unified geopolitical or unified response from the international community. And the really obvious explanation for why that hasn't taken place is sort of the rise of Chinese economic and diplomatic power. And that is really just a fact of our world. China has obviously an incredibly powerful economy and is extending, aid and loans all across the world, particularly in the Middle East and in Central Asia, where there are a lot of Muslim countries that might otherwise have spoken up on an issue like this. At least some of them. Certainly, China is a UN Security Council member and a member of the UNHRC, and commands a lot of force in international institutions. So it becomes really hard for countries to take decisive action against China over something like this. Whereas if you saw the same type of crisis in kind of a smaller, maybe less geopolitically significant country, arguably it might look a little bit different. And to the question of what we can sort of practically do on an individual level to help Uyghurs, I get asked this a lot, and it's actually really hard to answer because this isn't exactly, this is not at its core a humanitarian crisis. This is not the sort of problem that you can help solve just by donating money. This is a problem of a system that sort of needs to have a systemic solution. The solution needs to come out of sort of diplomatic or economic pressure, I think a lot of people would say. So for us as individuals, I think particularly if you live in Canada or in another kind of democratic country, and you have sort of the ability to pressure your elected officials in some way, I think a lot of people in the Uyghur community would want and appreciate that. Another thing is that there are published lists of companies that are doing business in Xinjiang, especially surveillance companies that are helping build the surveillance architecture there. And it's very easy to sort of vote with your dollars if you want to do it that way. And the third thing I would say is that if you are a member of the Uyghur diaspora, it's an incredibly kind of lonely and solitary thing. Many of these people have been essentially forcibly separated from their families. They're not able to reach their families back home. It's a really kind of traumatic experience. And I think that from my interactions with Uyghur diaspora members, they really appreciate seeing that people from outside of that community do care about this issue and sort of are willing to participate in political action or even just express solidarity in some way. So, I mean, there are Uyghur communities basically everywhere. So if there's one near you wherever you are, they might organize a protest or organize other kind of action. And if it's something that you're interested in, I think it's more than worth getting involved.
Thank you. I know Angeliki has a question over here.
Thank you. Fascinating talk. Following up on that last question, considering that the world has not protested the treatment of the Uyghurs by Beijing, and the fact that we have these protests in Hong Kong, would you have an opinion on what surveillance technologies Beijing is likely using in covering what's happening in Hong Kong? And since Beijing is, now the biggest international donor in the world. They just passed the US last year, and they are able to oppress the Uyghurs, Tibetans, etc. Are you surprised at all that Beijing has shown such restraint regarding the protests so far in Hong Kong?
Well, that's a really good question. Okay, as to your question about what surveillance technology is being used, I think everybody's sort of trying to figure out this question about whether facial recognition is being used and like sort of to what scale it's being used. And we as a news organization have also tried to parse this. And in fact, there is sort of little public information out there, and it's really hard to figure out. And this sort of speaks to like one of the issues with facial recognition, which is that you can't look at a camera and say like, oh, this is a facial recognition camera, or like this is scanning my my behavior or the way that I walk, right? It's just a camera. And all the stuff that happens is software that's applied to the video feed. So it's sort of hard to tell. I would be shocked if it wasn't being used in some way. Same with kind of more traditional forms of surveillance, like cell phone surveillance and stuff like that. Chinese government, of course, has a track record of using phishing and other kind of attacks to try to get activists of various stripes to download malware. This sort of most famously happened to the Tibetan exile community probably 5-6 years ago. There haven't been quite the same pace of reports about this kind of stuff happening, but sort of anecdotally in my conversations with dissidents and human rights activists and ethnic minorities who live abroad, they still report these same kinds of attacks. So I would, I would be surprised if that wasn't happening. And to your second question about why hasn't the crackdown been stronger in Hong Kong, I mean, I would really just be speculating. It's hard to say, but of course, Hong Kong is not only a place of tremendous kind of economic and political significance to China, it's also a place that I think that the broader kind of international investment community still needs to perceive as a sort of stable place. And when you have, I mean, if you were going to have police going out and shooting people up, then that's not a place that people will want to put their offices in and their personnel. It's not a place that people will consider to be a safe home for their money. And once again, I'm totally speculating, and I departed China sort of well before these protests started, so I don't have any real direct information about it, but just from the context I know about the way that past demonstrations have sort of, like the umbrella movement and stuff have gone in Hong Kong, that's sort of what I would suspect.
Is there another question from the floor? Yes, David.
Hi, you touched base on dystopian novels and looking at the intersection of how technology and privacy and facial recognition and all that is going on. Some novels are really starting to deal with this idea of using technology to combat that technology. And looking around, you can see things like Hyperface or CF Dazzle that have been specifically designed to deal with the threat of video surveillance. Do you have any thoughts on where these are going? Do you think it'll become commonplace? Or do you think that the technology that's going to arise to protect privacy is going to be something completely we haven't seen yet?
Yeah, it's a very interesting question. There's lots of different things, like there are these kinds of novelty masks and stuff that people wear. They're supposed to make you invisible in front of facial recognition cameras and stuff like that. I talked to a guy actually who is he's an ex-police officer in the UK, and he sort of I think he makes and sells CCTV cameras now. It's sort of his business. And we were talking about facial recognition. He was like, I don't see what the big deal is. All you have to do is stare down at your phone. And I think that's actually, it's true. It's a bit of like Occam's razor. You can, there are sort of easy fixes for this. But I guess the underlying problem is that you can't always do that. You can't always sort of hide your face or wear a mask. That can't be the norm for you. You might be able to do it during a protest or something like that. But yeah, I mean, perhaps there are new solutions that I'm not aware of or that nobody has thought of yet that will come out. Of course, when we're talking about cell phone surveillance, for instance, there's new solutions coming out all the time. There are these things called Faraday bags where you can put your phone in to avoid having it be tracked. There's, of course, encrypted messengers, which are used really widely now in a way that they weren't before. I think I think at the end of the day, the other point I want to make is that, I really have a deep respect for the technologists that are coming out with the stuff that is sort of privacy-minded. And, as a person who's been using Tor browser for a really long time, I've always appreciated the existence of technologies like that. But I do think that there's sort of a dearth of those kinds of technologies that actually function in these kind of new high surveillance environments. And having lived in China, I sort of experienced that firsthand, all of the stuff that you would use here in Canada just to preserve your privacy, VPNs and sort of things like that. A lot of that stuff just doesn't work in China. It just flat out doesn't work. And we're now seeing a lot of middle ground surveillance countries, places the the Russias, the Vietnams of the world, Turkey, Cambodia, a few other places like that, they're heading in the direction that China's already in. They're looking at the Chinese example and saying like, hey, that seems like a really good way to control people. So when we get to a point where there are lots of environments like that in the world, I think we need people that are sort of committed to developing technological solutions that will work in those environments in the same way that it would work here.
Megha, we have similar interest from a Twitter subscriber, who's Yasmin Alfaro Pena, who asked much the same question that's just been asked. What recommendation do you have in keeping your privacy safe as an international traveler? And you mentioned about in China and in here and what works differently. And then the second part of that question was, what are the communication apps or methods that you would recommend to communicate? And again, it's specific to internationally. So you've gone over some things, if there's anything you would like to add.
Yeah, I would just say that, I'm not a digital security expert, but the ones that I know almost uniformly recommend Signal as sort of the gold standard for privacy and messaging. I think it's really good. WhatsApp is also encrypted. It's not an app that specifically has privacy in mind, but it is encrypted end to end, which is really great. And so I would, if I was looking, I think that's the sort of the simplest out-of-the-box solution.
Okay, thank you. Are there other questions from the floor? Yes, one at the back.
Thank you for the information. This may not be directly related to the surveillance technology, but near the end of your presentation, you said something like to the effect that norms here affect everyone. Could you expand on that a little?
Yeah. Okay, so like if you're a company, for instance, and you're required to adhere to certain standards, not just privacy standards, just any kind of standards, maybe like production standards or environmental standards in a certain jurisdiction, it sort of reduces the cost for you to apply that in other areas. And that's not uniformly across the board, but it does happen, in lots of different ways. And that's one thing. The other thing is that I think a lot of kind of privacy activists in, the global south or in like more authoritarian contexts, they look at what's happening in places where, people actually have a little bit of a greater ability to pressure governments and companies to change what they're doing on privacy, and they sort of look at that as, this is a possibility, this is something that we could also try to accomplish. Or they could say, for instance, if a company like Google is putting across a certain privacy standard in North America, Google might then meet with privacy activists in a different part of the world, and they would say, well, you're already doing this in North America, why won't you do the same thing for us? And when I was reporting on Facebook, this is sort of one of the themes that I came across, which is that Facebook will be sort of very scrupulous in, something like moderating hate speech in a particular jurisdiction with where there's like a language like English or German that has a large number of speakers, and they would be a lot less scrupulous in kind of a small language, in a place like Myanmar or Sri Lanka. They wouldn't have appointed as many content moderators, and it was then possible for activists in those countries, activists for digital rights, to then say to Facebook, like, hey, you've applied this standard in Europe, like, why will you not give us the same treatment? So I think it has the ability to empower people in that way.
Thank you. We have a question from Facebook from Reina Oliveras that says, could you reflect on the roles of all the stakeholders, including businesses, government, and organized group, on top of the rights of the people that are being violated? Maybe you can answer just a portion of that, as I can see from our clock on the wall that time is running out.
Yeah, that's a tough one. I think that, all these stakeholders come from different perspectives. I think governments often, have just as much of a desire to balance privacy rights and security. I think that whether you're talking about businesses or governments, the key thing is transparency. I think transparency can also be of value to businesses and governments, especially businesses that are sort of looking for certain concrete standards to adhere to. Microsoft, for instance, has famously called for regulation of facial recognition technology. There's, of course, any number of reasons they might want to do that, but I think one of the reasons is that they want a certain standard to be able to be adhered to. So I think that I've talked mostly about the places where our interests might diverge with governments and companies, but that's not to say that there's not a lot of common ground, and I think that finding that common ground can often be really critical to finding solutions as well.
Are there any last questions on the floor? If not, I have a final one from, I think it's from Twitter, excuse me if I'm pronouncing this incorrectly, Jaideep Kaur, who asks, what are some of the surveillance measures you think governments can do away with?
It's a good question. Yeah. I mean, I think any kind of surveillance that's done without consent should be done away with. Like, I think there has to be a level of consent. And if you think about surveillance that's done through video, it is really hard to get consent. Right, you might put a sign up that says, oh, you're on candid camera or what have you, but you're being filmed before you see the sign, and there's no law that says the sign has to be up anyway. So I think it's really a tricky thing, but I think for me as a journalist, like the key principle is just transparency.
Thank you. Thank you to everyone who asked and submitted questions. Please join me once more in thanking Megha Rajagopalan from BuzzFeed News.
Thank you so much.
She traveled from the Middle East to be with us here in Winnipeg this evening, and we thank her for raising our awareness on digital surveillance and for providing us with concrete ideas about how to combat threats to our privacy. And to all of you, thank you for coming, and thank you for your interest in this important topic and for joining us in this conversation this evening. Merci, miigwech, good night.